Slow Dance at Dusk, Book 4 in a Sunburned Land series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Sarah Kennedy.
Chapters 21 to 28.
Chapter 21. Months rolled by, and with its passage, life on the station changed like the seasons. The rains were over, the days were once again hot but dry, with blue skies overhead and warm breezes rolling off the mountains. However, those were the minor changes. The real changes were wrought with the arrival of Serena, David, and baby Oliver. Serena and her family had a cottage of their own, just off the staff quarters to give them privacy. Maggie would have loved them nearer the main house or her and Frank's cottage by the lagoon, but Serena and David needed to have some space. Serena insisted on it, and Frank understood that even better than Maggie. Each day that she woke to find her daughter and grandson on the doorstep, the better the day. She was thrilled they'd chosen to come. David, a hands-on type of guy, was a much-needed help on the station. And Maggie helped with baby Oliver, allowing Serena to pursue her motivational speaking. She'd not expected Serena to go after this new venture the way she had. Before they'd been on the station a week, Serena had already met with several schools in Kununurra to discuss speaking engagements and workshops, plus the latest edition of weekend retreats at Goddard Downs for children from troubled homes. This weekend would see the first of those, and Serena was anxious. Maggie wasn't sure why. From what she'd garnered from friends in town, her talks had been well received. And she'd been approached from schools in towns further afield, inviting her to present similar talks to their students. Why she was anxious about a bunch of them coming to the station for the weekend, Maggie had no idea. Serena hovered in the kitchen of the main homestead, every now and then poking her head in to check on Oliver. He was on the floor being entertained by William, and by the sound of his gurgles, he was having a ball. Janella stirred a pot of stew on the stove while Maggie rolled dough on the counter. "Are you sure I can't help?" Serena asked. "It's all in hand, but thanks for offering," Janella replied. "You just need to be ready for those children." "I am. I've gone over my speech 100 times." "The dishes need washing." Maggie lifted a brow as she brought the rolling pin back to the centre and rolled the pastry out in an almost even circle, ready for the base of the apple pies she was making for dessert. "Okay, I'll do the dishes. I get the hint." Serena headed to the sink and turned on the tap. Maggie chuckled. "Cooking isn't your specialty, Serena. You know that." A small chuckle came from Janella, making Maggie smile. Janella didn't laugh often enough anymore, so even the slightest chuckle gave Maggie hope that Janella might soon turn a corner. She hoped the arrival of new faces would lighten her spirits and make her miss Caleb a little less. "You don't have to remind me, Mum," Serena said as she scrubbed the first pot. By the time the dishes were done, Oliver had grown restless. Serena picked him up and was bouncing him on her hip in the doorway. "As long as you're both okay here without me, I'll take him for a walk." "We're fine, sweetheart. Enjoy your walk," Maggie said, smiling. After Serena and Oliver left, Maggie turned to Janella and chuckled. "I'm not sure where I failed, but I sure hope you have more success than me with teaching her to cook." Janella chuckled too. "It's a challenge, that's for sure." Working with Janella felt almost like old times, except for the conversation, which was more subdued and less frequent than it used to be. Janella seemed to have so much on her mind, so much to handle, and yet she wasn't talking or allowing anyone to get close enough to share her burden. It grieved Maggie to witness it. She knew full well that in times of struggle, a helping hand could make all the difference. Janella knew it too. Still, there was a difference between knowing something and doing it, and right now, Janella was still in a state of inaction. "Thank you," Maggie said softly as she placed the top piece of dough on the pie. "For what?" Janella asked, her forehead creasing. "For agreeing to all of this. Cooking for 10 extra mouths. You agreed without question." Maggie turned and met Janella's gaze. "It means a lot to me that you're willing to help Serena, despite the pressure it places on you." Janella shrugged. "It's just a few extra heads and a slightly different menu. I actually feel a special kinship with this project, so it's not a burden. She placed the spatula she was using to spread the cheesecake batter on a plate. I'm glad to hear that, Maggie said. Most people don't see value in helping Indigenous kids, so any interest shown is good. So many of our kids are left to fend for themselves and they end up the same as their parents, in trouble. Serena sees children who need to be shown that they can rise above their situation. I think it's great. It's not easy being Indigenous in a mainly white society. Maggie was silent. She couldn't imagine what life was like for Janella or the other Indigenous folk on the station. She herself didn't see them as different, but hearing Janella speak, she realised that there was still a definite demarcation between one person and another based on their ethnicity. God made mankind in his image, she said. Out of the dust he made them, Janella replied. It's just a pity that some people forget that dust has many different shades. She chuckled softly. I'm glad you taught your children differently, Maggie. That people like Serena are willing to help kids that others would simply cast aside. I'll help this venture in any way I can. Just name it. Maggie's heart warmed. Perhaps this was the way God intended for Janella to awaken from her sorrow. It was the most spirit she'd seen in ages from her friend, and she would do whatever it took to keep it going. Perhaps there was more that Janella could do with this project. She'd make a mental note to speak with Serena. A short while later, Janella stood with Serena under the large shade tree outside the homestead waiting for the children to arrive. They'd received word from one of the hands that they were almost here. Moments later, an old white minibus pulled up outside the main homestead, sending a cloud of dust billowing into the air. The sides of the bus had turned red from the dust, but it seemed to have managed the rutted road without problem. The children were subdued as, one by one, they climbed out of the bus and gazed around. There were 10 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 15. They were dressed in shorts and t-shirts, and most had bare feet. Although Indigenous, these kids had been born and raised in Kununurra. They weren't familiar with the land, although it was in their blood. Their ancestors lived off the land and knew more about the seasons and animals than most cattle station owners, yet the old ways were dying. The kids of this generation filled their days with television and iPads, given to them by the government who thought they were doing something good, but it was slowly killing the kids' spirit. Good morning, children, Serena greeted the group with a smile, but her hands clung to each other tightly in front of her. Janella gave her an encouraging nod. Good morning, the children muttered back. Most avoided direct eye contact and stared at the ground. Welcome to Goddard Downs, Serena continued. We're excited to have you here and we hope you have a great weekend. My name's Serena. You've probably heard me speak at your school. She turned to Janella. This is Janella, and Goddard Downs has been her home since she was a girl. She's going to be spending a lot of time with you over the weekend. Janella lifted her hand and gave a wave. For the next 2 days, you're going to find out what life's like on a cattle station. We've got some special activities lined up like cooking, feeding the animals, learning to ride a horse, and perhaps even going on a cattle drive. All of this is thanks to our host, Mr. Goddard. Having just joined them, Frank stepped forward and smiled. Welcome, children. We're happy to have you here with us and hope you have a great time. This station's been in my family for 3 generations and we're very proud of it. It's beautiful country and I hope you enjoy all that it has to offer. When he stepped aside, the adults greeted each of the children in turn and learned their names. But as Janella looked at their faces, some smiling, some reserved, others calculating, her thoughts turned to Caleb. He was about the same age as a few of them. It had been months since she'd seen him in person. Skype was great, but it didn't compare with talking face to face. He assured her he was fine, although he missed her. He'd made some friends and was enjoying the various sports. Not so much maths and English, but that didn't surprise her. He'd never been overly studious. He'd rather be out with his grandfather, tinkering with things. She hoped these kids would enjoy their time here. As far as she was concerned, there was no better place to grow up. She and her kids had been spoiled. A few minutes later, Stella and Joshua arrived, and after being introduced to the children, they took them on a short walking tour of the property. They'd have a longer tour later, But Janella guessed most would be happy seeing the farm animals. A new litter of piglets had arrived the day before, and they were so cute. Serena followed behind with the teacher who'd accompanied the children, and Frank excused himself and said he'd be back a little later. There was something he needed to attend to with Maggie. Everyone had their place. Janella's was in the kitchen. She needed to get moving on lunch if it was going to be ready on time. She enjoyed the quiet of the kitchen during the day. Although there was always a lot to do, the silence made the act of preparing a meal almost therapeutic. She could clear her mind and concentrate on only what was in front of her. She didn't have to think of Caleb. She didn't have to think about Julian. All she had to think about was cutting vegetables and stirring meat. Sometimes it was good to have an empty mind. She would think about everything else when the meal was over. She kneaded the minced meat for the hamburger patties in a large bowl. There was something soothing about the way the mixture oozed through her fingers. She progressively added a variety of herbs and spices and was daydreaming when the kitchen door squeaked open. She glanced up. A youth hovered in the doorway. She stopped kneading and looked at him. Shaggy brown hair fell over his face, half obscuring his dark eyes. "Hello," she said. He gave the tiniest of nods. "What are you doing?" "I could ask you the same thing," Janella replied. "You work here?" It wasn't a question, more like a statement. Janella leaned against the counter and folded her arms. "I live here. This is my kitchen." The boy grunted. He was 14, perhaps 15, taller than her but lankier, much lankier. The clothes he wore looked like hand-me-downs and hung on his shoulders. "What's your name?" She tried to remember. It was on the tip of her tongue. John? Josh? "Why is it important?" "I like to know who I'm talking to, that's all," Janella replied lightly. He didn't answer, just stood there, gazing around, taking everything in. "What brought you here?" He shrugged. A smile tipped her lips as she returned her focus to the hamburger mince. "You're not much of a talker, are you? That's okay. You don't have to talk, but tell me, why aren't you with the others?" "Cows bore me," the boy finally replied, stepping fully into the kitchen and propping against the wall. "They bore me too, which is why I'm in here." She let out a small chuckle. "What are you making?" "Hamburgers." She gave the mince one final knead, then grabbed a handful and formed it into a patty. "My mum used to make burgers," the boy said glumly, then immediately went silent. Janella looked over at him. "Did she? Did you help her?" "Well, sometimes." "Would you like to help me?" A spark ignited in his eyes. Janella smiled as he walked over and stood at her side. "What do you need me to do?" "Chop some lettuce?" "I can do that." "First," Janella said, grabbing another handful of mince, "you need to wash your hands, and then I have to know what to call you. No assistant of mine gets to walk around my kitchen nameless." The boy smiled. A small smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Jonah." "Nice to meet you, Jonah. Now, let's get you to work. But tell me, does anyone know you're here? I don't want anyone worrying about you." "I asked that lady if I could go for a walk. You know, the one with the funny face." Janella cringed. She hated anyone commenting negatively on Serena's face, although it was bound to happen. Hopefully, in time, he and the other children would see past the scars and see the wonderful person Serena was and be motivated by her resilience. She nodded. "That's good. We don't have to worry." With Jonah working beside her, Janella couldn't help but think of Caleb, although he was nothing like her son. She learned that his mother had died 5 years earlier when he was 10. He was an only child and pretty much looked after himself since his father was drunk all the time. "You're a young man, Jonah. What do you plan to do with your life when you finish school?" "Nothing." His dismal response tugged at her heart. "You can be anything you want to be." He looked up, his gaze glassy. "My mum used to say that." "Your mother was right. You can be anything you want." He shook his head. "No, I can't. I'm not good at anything." "What are you talking about? You've just helped me prepare lunch for everyone and you did a great job. I don't get good grades. Grades aren't everything, Janella insisted. They can help, but it's not the end of the world if you don't know how to do algebra. Jonah laughed. Ah, a laugh. You have a handsome smile, Jonah. You should show it more often. His gaze dropped to the hamburger bun in his hand. You sound just like her. Is that why you came in here? He grew still and a tear fell on his hand. He quickly brushed it away. No. A deep sense of sorrow grew inside her. The boy before her was still mourning. He missed his mother, that was clear, even if he didn't want to admit it. If Janella could help him, she would. Keep cutting, she said exuberantly. We have a lot of hungry mouths headed our way. We need to have everything on the table in 10 minutes. Can I count on you to get this done? Jonah lifted his head and smiled. Yes, ma'am. Chapter 22. Kookaburra's laughing heralded the dawn of a new day. The sun peeked over the horizon, its rays filtering through the trees and into the homestead, casting it in a warm light. The station was waking up. Most of the staff were already about their business, and by the sound of dishes clattering in the kitchen when Joshua passed, Janella was already preparing breakfast for everyone, including the extra kids. But he didn't want to see anyone. He needed some time to think, alone. Yesterday had been an eye-opener. The kids from town had made him rethink whether he was truly ready to settle down and have a family. What if he messed up and his and Stella's kids ended up like them? Perhaps Janella had been right. Did he really know what he was doing? He headed to the stables and was saddling his horse when Stella walked towards him. She was wearing khaki shorts and shirt and brown lace-up ankle boots. Her high ponytail swished against her shoulders in time with her step, and she looked so hot that for a second he simply couldn't breathe. Her face lit up in a smile. Hey, handsome. Where are you off to? He gulped. It would be easy not to go. He closed his eyes and gulped again. No, he needed thinking time. For a ride. She traced her finger down his arm. I'd come with you if I didn't have to check on the calves. Her forehead creased. Are you okay, Josh? You look a bit downcast. He blew out a breath. Yeah, I'm fine. Are you sure? Prove it. She tilted her face upwards, and as she closed her eyes, her lips puckered. Oh, she shouldn't have done that. She rendered him as helpless as a small babe. His chest heaved, and casting his doubts aside, he threw his arms around her and kissed her hard. There. Does that prove it? He whispered against her lips. She chuckled. I think so. A bit longer, just to be sure. You're wicked, Stella Martin. His mouth pressed harder, capturing hers, sweeping his doubts aside. Are you sure now? Yes, I think you're fine. She grinned playfully and pulled away. I need to check those calves. Come with me? Sure, I can take a ride later. He removed the saddle and led Flame into the paddock. Don't go far, boy. He gave the horse a rub and sent him off with a gentle tap. Taking Stella's hand, they strolled along the track to the holding paddock where the new calves spent their first few weeks with their mothers. They were precious livestock, and Stella wanted them close so she could monitor them for any sign of disease or illness, which was impossible to do if they were out with the main herd. But as they walked, his thoughts from earlier returned. He had to talk with her. He thumbed the ring on her finger and cleared his throat. Stella, there's something I need to talk to you about. She looked up. Panic filled her face. What is it, Josh? Don't you want to get married? Is that it? He stopped walking and faced her. No, that's not it at all. I'd marry you this instant if I could. I want nothing more than to marry you, Stella. She sighed with relief. Then what? His throat felt thick and his lips dry. He rubbed his hand along his jaw. He had to say it. He couldn't stop now. I'm not ready to have kids. She blinked rapidly and then laughed. Oh, Josh. Don't laugh, Stella. This is serious. Seeing these kids, I don't know if I'm equipped to deal with children yet. I could so easily stuff up, and I don't want to. She rubbed his arms and looked deep into his eyes. We've talked about this before. I see a great man in you, Joshua Goddard. I see a wonderful husband and a wonderful father. But if you don't feel ready for children, then we don't have to have them right away. We can be careful, take precautions, until we feel ready. There's no hurry. It can be just you and me for however long we want. He blew out a slow breath. Oh, Stella, you always make me feel better. I don't know why I get so anxious. She smiled. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. He chuckled. You're right. I need to trust him more. You're good for me, Stella. Don't ever stop reminding me to look up. I want to be a godly husband for you, but I'm afraid I'm lacking. No, you're not. God knows your heart, and I'm sure he sees one that is seeking after him, and that's all that matters. He slipped his arms gently around her waist. Thank you, he whispered before gently pressing his lips to hers. If she believed in him, if she could see it, then he could believe it. Tightening his hold, he kissed her again until a small voice shouted, Uncle Josh! He released Stella and chuckled as Izzy bounded towards them, hands covering her mouth as she giggled. Oh, you were kissing Auntie Stella. He winked at Stella as he ruffled Isabel's hair. Yes, I was. She raised her eyes in a bashful glance but continued giggling. What are you doing out here at this time of the morning, little Izzy? He asked. I was going for a walk with Mummy and Daddy. They always go for a walk in the morning and I never get to come. But today I made them promise to take me. Joshua gazed around. Where are they? Coming. They're slowpokes. Oh. Just then, Nathan and Olivia, as well as William, who was perched on Olivia's hip, appeared in the distance and began hurrying towards them. The sun was at their back and Joshua had to hold his hand against his forehead. She got away from us, Nathan panted when he finally reached them. He crouched down in front of Isabel. Now, what did I tell you? Her head dropped. I have to stay close if I want to go on the walk with you and Mummy. So why didn't you? I wanted to play hide and seek. A moment later, Olivia reached them. Hide and seek, eh? You almost gave me a heart attack disappearing like that. She looked at Joshua and Stella. Sorry if Isabel interrupted anything. It's quite all right, Stella replied, grinning. She proved my point. Her point? It took a minute for Joshua to understand what she meant. The ease with which he'd handled Isabel, the simplicity of it, and how naturally he'd ruffled her hair and talked with her. It felt natural. Maybe there was more of a father in him than he thought. We'll leave you alone, Nathan said, taking Isabel's hand. Catch you later. Joshua tipped his hat and nodded. They were doing a riding session with the children later that morning. He'd been dreading it, but now he was actually looking forward to it. Maybe he could help those kids after all. Maybe he could warm to them like he warmed to Isabel. Maybe being a father wouldn't be as scary as he thought. The sun was fully up and the sky was a brilliant blue. He took Stella's hand and kissed it. It's going to be a beautiful day. She chuckled. Sure is. Later, after she and Joshua had returned from checking the calves and he had left to prepare for the riding lessons, Stella was checking her supplies in the shed, but her thoughts were on Joshua. His honesty was heartwarming, and even though he'd given her a heart attack when she thought he was going to break their engagement, with every step they took towards each other, the more excited and the more in love she felt, as if God was stitching them together in his great tapestry. There would be rough patches, of course. What relationship didn't have those? But with God, they could make it through anything. She headed to the house, but at the last moment decided to detour via the piglets and came face to face with Olivia. Oh, I didn't expect to see you here. Isabel and William wanted to look at the new piggies. Stella smiled at the children. They're very cute, aren't they? Yes, Isabel replied. I like the way they oink and run around. Can I hold one? Stella looked to Olivia, who shrugged. Okay, but you'll get your pretty dress dirty. That doesn't matter, Mummy will wash it. Olivia chuckled and shook her head. Okay, come with me. William, do you want to hold one too? Stella asked. He nodded and took her hand. Olivia followed and helped settle a small piglet into William's arms while Stella placed one into Isabel's. The look of joy on the children's faces made her heart glad, and a longing for her own children grew within her. But she needed to be patient. She'd promised Joshua there would be no hurry. She had to honour that. As the four headed to the homestead for morning tea a short while later, Isabel and William ran ahead, leaving Olivia and Stella to stroll along behind them. Thank you, Stella, Olivia said, smiling. What for? For bearing with my brother. I thought he'd be wild for the rest of his life. It wasn't what I wanted, and I prayed he'd settle and find his way. I never thought it would happen so quickly. I'm glad you had what it took to make him see his way forward and stop languishing in the past. God used you, and I'm sure he'll keep using you to bring out the best in Josh. Wow. Thank you. She honestly didn't know what to say. I mean it. I have no doubts that you, Miss Martin, are a Goddard woman waiting to happen. It takes a certain strength to lead the lives we lead and love the men we do, but I see it in you. It's a God-given gift to bring out the best in a man. The wrong woman can bring out the worst, but you make Joshua shine. Stella blinked. Really? Like a new penny, Olivia chortled. Isabel skipped up to them, her brow wrinkling. Uncle Joshua doesn't look like a penny. The two women laughed. He does on the inside, Stella stated, ruffling her hair. Isabel continued to frown but didn't ask anything further. I look forward to calling you sister, Olivia said a moment later. Stella's eyes widened, her lips parting as she held Olivia's gaze. She'd never had a sister, but then neither had Olivia. Her eyes glistened and Stella murmured a thank you. I always wanted sisters when I was little, Olivia continued. Now I'm all grown up and have children of my own, and suddenly I've got 3. You, Serena, and Janella. God works in mysterious ways. He does, doesn't he? Olivia nodded. You've given my brother back to us. That means more to me than you can ever imagine, especially after losing Julian. I thought we'd lost Joshua a long time ago, and after Julian's death he'd be gone completely. But he's still here, at least for now. She paused. Once you two marry, things may change, and you might want to start out on your own. I don't think so. Goddard Downs is our home. Where else would we go? Olivia shrugged. We'll see. Let's grab a coffee and clean these kids up. Chapter 23. The first weekend retreat was deemed a success, and more were planned. However, with the children gone, the focus turned to the wedding preparations. Janella had joined most of the family on a trip to Darwin to shop for new clothes and other bits and pieces. It was a rare time when so many of them were off the station at the same time, but Nathan and David had offered to stay behind and were managing things with the help of the hands. It was a whirlwind trip, just 3 days, but long enough for them to find what they needed and get back home. Janella's reasons for going to the city were far from trousseaux and suits. She was there to see her son. It felt like a lifetime since she'd last been with Caleb, although it had only been a few months. She missed him so much and couldn't wait to see him. Approaching the main building, she scanned the group of students she passed, but he wasn't amongst them, so she headed to the reception desk. A man of about 50 sat behind it and looked up. His nice smile helped ease her anxiety. Hello, she said. I'm here to see Caleb Goddard. You're his mother? She nodded. She'd phoned ahead to say she was coming. One moment. He picked up the phone while scanning a list stuck to the top of his desk. After a few moments, he spoke into the receiver. Caleb, your mother's here to see you. He nodded, hung up, and then told Janella that Caleb was on his way. She hovered near the desk while she waited. The reception area was cavernous. She remembered it from when she'd brought Caleb to the school just a few months ago. It had seemed just as imposing then, with its vaulted ceiling and tiled floor that made the room echo. "Your son's a fine young man, Mrs. Goddard," the man said. "Thank you." "He's very polite. Children nowadays don't seem to mind their manners or respect their elders, but he does. You've done a mighty job." Her heart swelled with pride, not for her, but for Caleb. Having a stranger speak so highly of her son made her prouder than ever. "We did our best." The man nodded towards the steps. "Here he comes." Janella followed the direction of his nod. Caleb looked so dashing in his uniform. He bounded down the staircase towards her. "Mum!" Tears pricked her eyes. "Caleb!" she said as he ran into her embrace. She kissed both of his cheeks before she caught herself. "Sorry, you're a big boy now and I'm sure you don't want your mother kissing you in public." He grinned and hugged her tighter. "I missed you. Not as much as I've missed you. Let me get a good look at you." She took a step back and cast her gaze over him. He'd grown an inch taller already, she was sure of it, and he'd filled out. "I didn't think I'd see you before I came home for Uncle Josh's wedding. The others were coming to Darwin to shop for clothes, so I came along. I wanted to see you." "I can't believe he's getting married." Janella chuckled. "Nor can I, but I'm happy about it. Stella's good for him." "I think so too," Caleb agreed, sounding very mature. "I like her. She's smart and fun." Janella smiled as they strolled out the main door and into the warm sunlight. The day was glorious, and she was very glad she'd made the long trip. "How are you liking it here? Is everything going well?" He nodded. "I've made some friends. They're pretty cool. They love the same video games as me, and last year one of the boys went to Russia with his parents. They're missionaries, and his dad was sent there to do some work for their church." "Russia? Wow! Have all the boys travelled? Do you feel bad that you haven't?" Caleb shook his head. "No, they all want to come home with me. They've never been to a cattle station before and they want to see what it's like." "Well, I'm sure we can figure something out. Serena had a group of students from town stay at the station last weekend. There was one boy, Jonah, who was a real help to me in the kitchen." She hugged Caleb to her side. "He reminded me of you." "Really?" "Yes, he's a little older and a bit taller, but there was something about him that made me think of you. I suppose that's why I let him help me in the kitchen. His mum died a few years ago, and his dad hasn't done well ever since. The boy seemed a bit lost." "That's sad. Well, maybe you can help him." Janella frowned. "How could I do that?" Caleb's face scrunched. "You're the best mum in the world and he doesn't have one. Maybe you could be there for him just like his mum would have been." Janella was dumbfounded. Her son had left home as a boy but was already mature beyond his years. "Do you really think I could do that?" "I know so. He's lost because he doesn't have a mother. If he had you or someone like you in his life, he'd do so much better." "That's a very grown-up thing to say," Janella said, pride once again swelling within her. "It makes sense, Mum. If I were a boy who didn't have a mother, I'd want you for my mum." She smiled, pushing back the tears that were stinging her eyes. "Thank you, Caleb. That's a lovely thing to say." "I mean it," he said, grinning. Pulling him close, she gave him a tight hug. "Thank you. Hey, are you hungry?" He laughed. "Always." "Why don't we find something to eat? When do you have to be back?" "I don't have any more classes today. There's a teachers' meeting for the next 2 periods and then school's done for the day." "That means I could take you out for lunch and maybe dinner too." "We'll have to get a permission slip." "Of course." They returned to the main office area where Janella quickly filled out the form. Within moments, Caleb's leave was approved, but before venturing out, they went to his room so he could get changed. Janella smiled to see a picture of the entire family stuck to the side of his small wardrobe. As they headed out, she glanced at her son and grinned. There was no doubt that Julian would be proud of his son. "Janella was having a good time tonight," Frank said as he took hold of Maggie's hand and kissed it gently. "Yes, she did seem to be having fun. It's the first time in a long time." Let's hope it's not the last." Maggie nodded in agreement. "I'm glad we could steal away," Frank commented as they strolled along the wharf, leaving Pearl's, their favourite restaurant, behind. The rest of the family group was still there, enjoying what remained of their meal. "It seems that every time we come back here, it's because something is about to change in our lives," Maggie said. "Our first date, when you proposed, and now with Joshua and Stella getting married." Frank nodded. This place seems to mark good things in our lives." Maggie's observation was accurate, as always. He was glad they had someplace special where they could celebrate these special milestones. Although tonight it was shared with their family, it still felt like just theirs. "The next trip we take has to be our holiday back to Broome." "Oh, yes," Maggie said, smiling. "I'm so looking forward to returning to the sun and the sand and seeing you in your swim trunks." She grinned. Stopping, Frank turned and gazed into her eyes. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" Maggie chuckled. "Not yet." "How remiss of me," he said, gently pressing his lips to hers. "I love you, Maggie Goddard." "And I love you, Frank Goddard." She smiled as she kissed him back. He slipped his arm across her shoulders and they continued their stroll. Only a slice of the moon was out, and the sky sparkled with a swathe of stars. "It's beautiful," Maggie said, leaning into him. He nodded. "It definitely is." They made their way to their bench and took a seat. Maggie nestled closer, resting her head on his shoulder as they gazed across the water. He rubbed her arm. "What's this I'm hearing about the hens and bucks night?" "Oh, Joshua and Stella have decided to forgo separate events and do one big party 2 days before the wedding at a restaurant in Kununurra or at the station. They haven't quite decided." He frowned. "Why haven't they? Isn't having it 2 days before the wedding a bit too much? And if they want to have it at home, shouldn't Janella be preparing for it by now?" Maggie threw her head back and laughed and then squeezed his hand. "If it was any earlier, Stella's family wouldn't be here. It's a long drive from Kununurra back home. And they need all the time they can get to prepare for the big day and make sure everyone's rested. So having it at home makes the most sense. Although it'll mean extra work for us, expenses will be kept down. And there's still plenty of time to shop. I'll help Janella, but Elizabeth has been amazing. She's a born organiser, and she and Janella will pull it together, I'm sure." Frank smiled. No matter how many times he heard Maggie call Goddard Downs home, it still didn't feel real. It felt like just yesterday that he'd proposed, and it felt like a dream that she'd married him at all. But their marriage and life together was real, and he was the most blessed of men to call her his wife. "They'll need to send out invitations soon," Maggie added, drawing Frank away from his thoughts. "They should, if they want anyone to come." "Don't worry, everything's in hand, although there's a lot to do when planning a wedding, but Serena, Olivia, Janella, Elizabeth and I will make sure it all comes off without a hitch." He pulled Maggie close and hugged her tight. "Thank you for being so wonderful and for taking such a big part in all of this." She smiled. "Joshua might not be my son by blood, but he's my son at heart, and this wedding has allowed us to grow closer and for me to feel more of a mother to him. I'm grateful to be able to help and am honoured to be part of this wonderful work of God." Frank stroked her arm with his hand as he stared across the water. "God does so much that we don't understand. Months ago, we were lamenting Julian's death. Today, we're celebrating the coming union of two people under God's greatest covenant." He released a long breath and faced her. "I'm glad you've been with me through it all, my love. I don't know how I would have made it if you hadn't been by my side, praying, reminding me that God sees the big picture and that no matter what, He's in control." He tipped her chin with his finger and gazed into her eyes. Tears glistened in them as he lowered his mouth and brushed his lips against hers. He'd thought that loving Esther meant he could never love another. He was so thankful to have been wrong. God had brought 2 wonderful women into his life. He was truly blessed. Chapter 24. Frank tapped his leg as he waited for the loan agent to call them in. Joshua sat beside him, his hands wringing together as he leaned over his knees, his elbows pressing into them. "What's taking so long? We had a 3 o'clock appointment," he grumbled. "I think it's normal for appointments to run late, son," Frank said, although he was also impatient to hear whether the bank had finally approved their loan or not. "We just have to be patient." Joshua released a big breath. A few moments later, an older man with a balding patch and spectacles poked his head around the door and waved them over. "Sorry I got held up, Frank, Joshua. Good to see you both." He extended his hand and shook theirs in turn. "It's not a problem, Cam. We understand," Frank said. The man had been in constant contact with them over the past months as they'd negotiated the loan and the proposed purchase of Indigo, and he'd become a firm friend. "Take a seat." He waved to the chairs on the opposite side of the desk as he eased his large frame into a leather armchair. A ficus plant filled one corner of the room, providing some colour to the otherwise stark walls. A computer sat in the bend of his L-shaped desk. Trays of papers marked Received, Approved, and Pending sat on the right. The Goddard file was on the top of the pending tray. Frank took a long breath and uttered one final prayer. So much hung on this deal. Somehow, they'd been able to keep it from Stella. As expected, she'd dismissed the idea of running extra head of cattle on Goddard Downs and believed the deal was off the table. She had no idea they were planning on buying Indigo. Just as well, because it wasn't a done deal. Yet. Joshua's heel tapped the floor as they waited for the final answer. He was more anxious than Frank. While this was simply a business deal to him, it was Joshua's life, his future with Stella. Frank placed a hand on his knee. "Stop," he whispered. The tapping ceased. Cam leaned forward, folding his arms on the desk. A small grin appeared on his face. "I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Your loan's approved." Frank exhaled the breath he'd been holding, while Joshua clapped a hand on Frank's shoulder and shook his arm so vigorously that Frank thought it might wrench out of its socket. "We got it, Dad! Stella's going to go crazy when she finds out. I can't wait to tell her. This is going to be the best wedding present ever!" Looking at his son's smiling face, Frank couldn't help but feel joy and sorrow. His son's happiness meant he'd be leaving his side, possibly for good. Though Indigo wasn't far away, it was far enough. But it felt right that he and Stella start their married life without the shadows of the past holding them back. "Yes, she will be," he said. "I'm happy we were able to oblige you in the end. I'm only sorry it took so long," Cam said. Frank shrugged. "It's okay. Everything in God's time. And we were able to push out the time frame with Ravi Tamala, so all's well." Ravi had been surprisingly understanding and had kept the deal on the table despite it taking much longer than originally expected to get an answer. "So, what's next?" "A ton of paperwork. If you've got the time, we can make a start now." "We've got the time if you have," Frank said. "Rightio." Cam opened their file and pulled out a wad of paperwork about an inch thick. "I'll explain these to you as best I can, but you should go through them with a lawyer before signing them." Frank had figured as much. Confident that the loan would be approved, he'd set up a tentative appointment with their lawyer for 4 o'clock. Cam quickly explained the terms of the loan and then placed the paperwork into a large envelope which he handed to Frank. "Get them back to me as soon as you can." Frank took the envelope and he and Joshua stood. "Thanks. We might even get them back to you today." "Great. Oh, and Joshua." "Yes?" Joshua angled his head. "All the best for your wedding. I hear it's soon." Extending his hand, he smiled. "Yes, it is. 3 weeks and counting." Beaming, Joshua shook Cam's hand. "Thank you." Cam nodded. "You're welcome." Frank and Joshua left the office and walked out of the bank, heads high and spirits soaring. It was happening. They were about to become the owners of Indigo Downs, at least for a while, until Joshua handed over the deed to Stella as a wedding gift. "This has to be the best day of my life," Joshua said as they walked the 3 blocks to the lawyer's office. "I can't wait to see Stella's face." "I know," Frank replied. but be patient. Your wedding day will be here before you know it." They rounded a corner, and as they passed the door of a bar, out stumbled a familiar face. "Sean?" Frank blinked. He couldn't believe it. "Uncle Frank!" Sean staggered to a halt and stared at him before swinging his unsteady gaze to Joshua. "Josh?" Joshua drew a long breath. "Sean." "It's been a while, Sean. How've you been?" Frank asked, although by the smell of the alcohol on his breath, Frank already knew. "Fine," Sean replied, his gaze still on Joshua. He raised his chin slightly. "How are things?" "Good," Joshua answered. "I'm getting married." Sean scoffed. "You're making a mistake. You know that." "I'm not. It's the best choice I've ever made." Sean smacked his lips and backed away. "Well, it's been nice seeing you both. I've got some fun to have. I'll be seeing you." Joshua went to follow him but stopped. Frank knew how hard it must be for him to see his cousin in such a state. They'd been so close for so long. "He's making his own choices, son." "I wish he'd make better ones," Joshua mumbled. Frank patted him on the back. "He'll come around one day. Mark my words." "I'm not so sure about that. He's livid about me getting married." "I think he's envious. Anyway, he's a grown man, and we have paperwork to sign." Joshua blew out another breath. "Yes, you're right. We'll keep him in our prayers. That's all we can do." Joshua nodded as they continued along the street. No doubt seeing Sean had taken the shine off the loan approval, but only momentarily. As soon as they sat down with the lawyer, the reality that Indigo Downs would soon be theirs would be as real as the light of day. Chapter 25. Joshua and Stella's wedding was less than 2 weeks away, but something else played on Janella's mind. Caleb's words echoed in her head, confirmation of the voice that whispered in her heart. "Help Jonah. He needs someone to believe in him. He needs you to believe in him." No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the voice. She told herself it wasn't her place. He had teachers, and it was Serena, not her, who was heading up the program. She should be the last person to intercede. Regardless, the voice kept whispering, tugging at her heart, until she had no choice but to make the trip she was now taking. Since she didn't go into town very often on her own, she hoped no one would quiz her about what she was doing there, or offer to go with her, because she guessed they might try to stop her if they knew. She'd do some shopping for the Bucks and Hens party while there, so at least she could use that as a legitimate excuse. But no one quizzed her, although Frank was a little concerned about her driving there and back on her own. She started the engine and headed down the track. The landscape took on a new beauty as she drove through the harsh terrain. Bauhinia clustered near a mound of large rocks. The shrub wasn't the prettiest, but it was quite useful. Her ancestors used the nectar and gum, which was sweet, for food, while the bark was used for treating headaches and fever. It burned well and was good for firewood. Towering boab trees with their thick trunks stood like pot-bellied sentinels watching over the land. She remembered climbing them as a child when she and Julian would go exploring between his classes at the School of the Air. She hadn't attended school as he did. Her lessons had been different, but nonetheless valuable. Before her family came to Goddard Downs, she'd gone to a school where she not only learned to read and write, but about the heritage of her people. Caleb and Sasha didn't have that kind of education, but she'd taught them what they needed to know. They were fortunate to have parents from different backgrounds. The differences between her and Julian made for a richer life for their children. Slowly, the terrain changed, and with it, Janella's mood. The calm she felt soon turned to anxiety as the open plains gave way to buildings and homes, and the roads, which had been quiet, teemed with noisy traffic. She could never be a town dweller. The noise and busyness would steal her peace, and that was something she wasn't willing to give up. And youth crime was on the rise. Only 2 months earlier, a terrible incident in Kununurra had left the townsfolk shaken. An Indigenous youth, high on drugs and alcohol, raped and killed a teenage girl. Things had to change. Serena's program was a step in the right direction, but for many, it had come too late. The question burned in Janella's heart. Was it too late to help Jonah? She prayed not. The boy needed help. Her help. And she was going to give it. She was determined. Caleb was right. Jonah needed a mother figure to believe in him. But first, she had to speak with his father. She'd gotten Jonah's address from the school counsellor. The woman questioned her motives at first, but after Janella assured her that she only wanted to help and that she worked alongside Serena, the woman conceded and divulged the address. After referring to her directions several times, she finally found the street. The area was run down. Gutted cars piled on empty lots, broken bottles and rubbish littered the footpath, and graffiti covered the walls of vacant buildings. There wasn't a hint of green anywhere, and the air reeked of tobacco and something else as she drove past a group of young men playing dice on the corner. Looking into their eyes, she saw emptiness, lives devoid of hope. Her heart cried for them. Lord, I pray one day they'll find their way, that they'll know what it is to live, not just exist. Draw them to yourself, Lord. Give them hope. Give them life. Janella almost changed her mind as she parked the Jeep outside the small blue house with a broken front window. Instead of grass, the front yard was filled with dirt and straggly weeds. An old rusty car stacked on bricks sat in the driveway. There was no sign of wheels anywhere. She'd come this far, so she couldn't turn back now. She locked the car door and walked toward the driveway, glancing in both directions to see if anyone on the street was taking note of her. The boys she'd passed seemed more preoccupied with their dice than her, and no one else was about. Perhaps she should have asked Frank or Joshua to come with her. But she'd wanted to make this trip alone since she didn't want to embarrass Jonah. It was one thing to have someone come to your house unexpected and offer help, but it was another when they brought people with them you weren't close to. It made it feel more like charity and not kindness. It became a spectacle, and the last thing Janella wanted was for Jonah or his father to feel apprehensive about what she was offering. Heart pounding, she walked carefully up the 2 rotting steps onto the porch and knocked on the door. There was no response. She waited, fidgeting with her hands and glancing up and down the street to see if anyone was watching. It wasn't the safest place, and if Julian were alive, he'd be upset to know she was there alone. After several seconds, she knocked again. Hello? Anyone home?
Quit your shouting. People are trying to sleep.
A male voice responded from inside. Janella stepped back at the sound of movement and a hissed curse. A man, dressed in striped boxers and a button-down shirt he hadn't bothered to fasten, opened the door a moment later. His frame was gaunt, his hair shaggy and greasy, and he reeked of stale alcohol. He looked her over.
I don't want whatever it is you're selling. Off you go.
He tried to close the door, but Janella stuck her foot in it. I'm not selling anything. I'm here about your son, Jonah. He eyed her suspiciously.
What about Jonah?
She cleared her throat. Mr. Barampa, my name's Janella Goddard. I work at Goddard Downs, the cattle station in the Kimberley where Jonah's been going on weekends.
So?
I'd like a moment to speak with you if you have some time. He groaned.
What did he do? He did something, didn't he? I knew that boy would only get himself in trouble. I knew it.
No, sir. Jonah hasn't done anything wrong. He's been nothing but a huge help to me. His brow wrinkled into deep creases that changed his features completely, making him look 10 years older. She wasn't sure that it was concern for Jonah that aged him, or the harshness of his life.
Then why are you here?
She sighed. Could we speak inside? This matter won't take long, but it's one I'd rather discuss away from the ears of others. She met his gaze and held it. Again, she saw hopelessness in the eyes staring back at her. He stepped inside.
Come in.
His voice was gruff and not the least bit friendly or welcoming. Thank you. Janella gave a small smile. The house was small but appeared even smaller due to the many dark corners. There was a smell of mildew and the air was thick, as if the windows hadn't been opened in years. By the looks of the dust on them, it might very well have been that long.
This way, he said, pointing to a small sitting room to the left. Give me a minute to make myself presentable.
Janella gave a nod and headed for the room. The carpet was old, matted, and heavily stained. She didn't want to think what from. The couch was green and reminded her of the moss found on the base of trees. She stepped towards it and part of her cringed, but she forced herself to sit. There was a single chair across from it, but she felt better about the couch than the piece of brown furniture. She didn't want to make Jonah's father feel uncomfortable, as if she was shunning his home. Still, she kept her arms and bag close to her body while she perched on the edge of the seat and wondered at the wisdom of entering the house in the first place. He seemed harmless enough, but Julian would have been horrified that she was there at all. When he returned, Mr. Baramba looked moderately better. He was now wearing pants, for which she was thankful, and the shirt was buttoned and tucked in. His hair was slicked back against his head, the unruly ends sticking up in places. He took a seat in the chair across from her.
So, you said you hear about Jonah?
Yes, I am. She swallowed her anxiety. Lord, give me strength. I wanted to speak to you about his future. She didn't expect her declaration to elicit a laugh, but it did.
What future?
You've thought about what Jonah's going to do once he leaves the community school, haven't you? He shook his head.
Nah, haven't given it a thought.
Well, I have. His eyes narrowed. She swallowed hard. I think his son's very talented. He's been helping me in the kitchen, and he has a natural talent. Something he says he learned from his mother. He stiffened slightly and glanced away. Jonah told me you lost your wife some years ago. I'm sorry. He swung his gaze back to her.
What does that have to do with you? You didn't know us. Why should you be sorry? Did you make her sick? Did you let her die?
Grief and despair made him talk that way, so she didn't react. Instead, she continued with what she'd come to say and hoped that by sharing some of her own grief, he'd be open to her proposal. I know how difficult it is to lose the person you love. My husband died less than a year ago. It still feels like yesterday. I have 2 children, Caleb and Sasha. They mean the world to me, as I am sure Jonah means to you. If anything were to happen to me, I'd want someone to help them.
Is that why you're here?
Mr. Baramba sprang to his feet.
We don't need help. We're doing just fine.
Janella remained seated. With all due respect, I don't think so.
What do you know about it? You've come here to judge the way we live.
Not at all. I came here because your son came to me. He saw something in me that he needed, and I'm here because I'm willing to give him that.
What does he need from you?
Someone to believe in him. Her words seemed to hit home. He stared at her, the lump in his throat bobbing. Your son can be great. I know it. I believe it. I have faith that he could do wonderful things, but he needs help. That's why I came to you. As his father, I know you'd only want the best for him. I also thought it preferable to gain your approval before I went ahead. But whether you agree or refuse, I intend to help your son one way or another.
Then why come at all?
Because it would mean the world to Jonah if you supported him. If you were the one to encourage him in his pursuits.
Well, what pursuits?
His brows came together and she could almost see his mind ticking over. Culinary school. Her heart raced. She was relieved he hadn't turned her out of the house yet. She'd been brazen, but she had to keep going. She had to say all she'd come to say. She didn't know where the boldness was coming from or the words. She hadn't a clue what she would say before he opened the door, but now the words flowed out of her and she prayed that each one hit the mark. Mr. Baramba lowered himself into his seat.
Culinary school is expensive.
It can be, but there are scholarships and grants he can apply for, I can also lend a hand if you'd let me." He eyed her skeptically.
"Why are you doing this?"
She smiled. "Because the day I met your son, I saw my own. I thought of how I'd feel if Caleb lost me and didn't know how to find his way. Then I spoke to my son. He told me that I should help Jonah, that he needs a mother figure in his life and that I was the right person to help in that department."
"Jonah had a mother."
His voice softened.
"He doesn't need another."
"He needs someone to love him as a mother does. In the weeks since he started coming to Goddard Downs, I've grown to love your son like my own. He has such a quiet spirit, but he hides so much behind bravado, trying to seem tough and strong, while inside he's scared and lonely. He's still grieving," Janella continued.
"You both are."
Mr. Baramba blew out a breath and gazed out the filthy window.
"When my wife was alive, everything was great. She made sure of it. That boy couldn't leave this house with a wrinkle in his clothes or a hair out of place. My Miriam was a great mother. There was no one like her."
His gaze narrowed on Janella.
"No one."
"I'm not trying to replace her. I just want to be there for Jonah. Please, Mr. Baramba, I need your help. Your son needs your help. He needs you to believe in him. He needs you to come back from where you are and be his father again." He bristled, but she pushed on. "Please hear me out. I don't mean to offend, and I'm certainly not here to judge. I just see a family in need of help. You're both still feeling the hollowness of loss, the pain of knowing you'll never see your Miriam again. But Jonah needs you, Mr. Baramba." She didn't expect what happened next. A sniffle broke the dam, and the man across from her, who seemed so gruff and belligerent, began to weep.
"Don't you think I know? I'm no good for my son. It kills me. I don't know what to do, where to start."
Janella swallowed hard, unsure of what to do. "Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing." She took a deep breath. "You can start by allowing me to help. I know you don't want things to be this way. I know you want what's best for Jonah and for yourself. You've lost your way, but you can find it again. You just have to make a start." She stood and walked towards him, stretching out her hand. "Let me partner with you. I believe we can make a difference if we work together. I truly do. You don't know me, and you have no reason to believe or trust me, but I'm asking you, begging you. Let me be a friend to you both." He gazed at her hand as if it would sprout teeth and bite, but slowly the apprehension melted away. He stood and took her hand.
"You really believe you can help my boy? Turn things around for him?"
She smiled. "For both of you, if you let me." Tears welled in his eyes and he nodded. Janella's heart leaped inside her. "That's wonderful. I brought some things for you to look over. We can go through them now if you like, or I can leave them with you and come back another time."
"We can look at them now. Jonah's out and he won't be back for a while."
"Good. I want him to think this came from you more than from me. Shall we start?" she asked eagerly. He nodded.
"Fire away."
Chapter 26. The lawn at Goddard Downs was filled with bucks and hens, not the feathered variety. The human variety, all raring to have a good time before Joshua and Stella tied the knot. Work on the station had been suspended in the days before to ensure everything was ready for the party. Every eco hut and guest accommodation was packed with partygoers. Maggie was working double time in the kitchen with Janella, Sasha and Jonah to make sure everyone was fed and watered. It was a bit hectic, but she was enjoying herself. Even now, as she stood julienning vegetables, she was humming a favourite tune in her head. 2 days. Can you believe it's just 2 days until the wedding? She asked Janella as she popped a carrot stick in her mouth. The vegetable crunched loudly in her ears and tasted so sweet.
These are a good bunch." "Yes, the vegetables have done well this year," Janella replied. "And yes, it's hard to believe Joshua will be married so soon. It seems like yesterday he was still this lost man trying to find his way. Despite my initial misgivings about the marriage, he's grown into a responsible man." She sighed thoughtfully. If only Julian could have seen it. It's all he ever wanted for his brother. Maggie let out a deep breath and smiled sympathetically. She knew how hard it still was for Janella to accept that Julian was gone. He would have been proud. "Yes, he would have been," Janella said, nodding. "Where do you want these, Janella?" Jonah interrupted. He had a tray of freshly washed blueberries in his hand. His hair was pulled back in a short ponytail, revealing his handsome features. "You should wear your hair like that more often," Maggie said, smiling. "It shows how handsome you are." Janella nodded. "I agree. And you can put the blueberries next to the strawberries and then get to squeezing lemons." Jonah acted without question. His focus and commitment was inspiring. Of all the children who'd come to Goddard Downs, he showed the most potential. Though the project was Serena's idea, Maggie believed it was God-inspired, and because of it, Jonah had found the help he needed. Serena wasn't the door to him moving forward. Janella was, and Maggie could already see the change in her. Her spark had returned, praise God. She leaned closer to her friend. "He's a good boy." "That he is," Janella beamed as she glanced away. "And he and Caleb get along so well. I was a little anxious when they met, but it's like they've known each other all their lives. They've bonded over some computer game where the characters do wacky dances." Maggie chuckled. "I'm glad. And how does Sasha like him?" She lowered her voice. Sasha was focused on decorating a fruit flan, but Maggie didn't want her to hear them talking about her. "The same," Janella replied, glancing at her daughter. "They talk about recipes mostly. Boys and girls at their age can be a bit awkward together, and Sasha has her friends and interests, and so does Jonah, so they don't talk much outside of food making." A roar of laughter drifted in from outside. "Sounds like the Martin clan are having a grand time." Maggie peered out the window to see what they were laughing at. "Sounds like it. They're quite the bunch," Janella chuckled. "Not quite what I expected, knowing Stella, but nice people all the same." "They're what you'd call eccentric," Janella said as she added some herbs to the bolognese she was making. Stella's family outnumbered the Goddards 2-1. Some were loud and boisterous, others so reserved they hardly spoke. Maggie knew from conversations that they all didn't share Stella's beliefs, but they weren't judgmental about it. They loved her and were there to support her, even if they didn't entirely understand the rush to wed. Some didn't think marriage was necessary at all, but that was another matter. Since their arrival 2 days before, Maggie had taken the opportunity to get to know them, as did the rest of the family. After all, they were about to become connected for the rest of their lives. "I can see why Stella wanted an intimate ceremony," Janella commented. She stirred the kangaroo bolognese. Before moving to Goddard Downs, Maggie hadn't tasted kangaroo, but it was as tasty as beef and gave the dish a twist. Janella was a master of concocting recipes that turned out great every time. "Yes," Maggie agreed. What with her large family, everyone here on the station, plus their friends from all over, there were far too many people for them to invite any others. "I hope no one was offended they didn't get invited to the wedding." "What does it matter?" Janella shrugged. "They'll get over it. If they don't, then Stella and Josh will know who truly cares about them. When Julian and I married, we didn't have a huge wedding. Some people took offence and refused to speak to us after, but we took that as God eliminating those who couldn't help us on the next stage of our lives." Maggie smiled. "Well said." "Janella," Jonah said hesitantly, as if he didn't want to interrupt. She looked in his direction. "Yes, love." "After the lemons, what do you want me to do?" He had a row of lemons lined up on the counter in front of him as he worked a hand juicer in his palms. "One thing at a time, Jonah. You're always rushing ahead. When you're almost done with those, I'll let you know what's next." She chuckled and looked at Maggie. "Always ready to work, I love it," she whispered. Maggie brought the crudité to where Janella stood and started arranging the tray. She leaned close and whispered, "How are things with the culinary school applications?"
Janella glanced over her shoulder before answering. Great. It took a little convincing, but once he realised that his father and I were behind him, he was willing to try. I plan to take some photos of the desserts he's made for tonight and add them to his portfolio. Portfolio? Maggie's brows scrunched. She'd heard of portfolios for art, design, and even writing. She had one for herself, but for food. Yes, cooking isn't simply cooking, it's art. Having a portfolio will help him not only have something to show the admission boards of the schools and hopefully make up for what he might lack in grades, but he can continue to add to it as he learns more and improves. Later, it can make a big impression when showing a prospective employer. Maggie marvelled. How do you know all this? Janella chuckled. I was doing some reading and came across an article. You know I like to look at new recipes to inspire me with my own. Well, there was an article on Food Magazine's website, and I read it. Maggie laughed. There's so much more to you than meets the eye, Janella. Have you ever considered going to culinary school yourself? You'd be amazing. Not me. I'm too old. Besides, I have too much to do here. That's not true, Maggie protested. Age doesn't matter, or did you miss that memo? You can do anything you want at any age. Moses was 80 when he went before Pharaoh to free the Israelites, and he believed he lacked the skill to speak and do the job, but we know how that ended. You have a God-given gift to be a great chef. Janella chuckled and shook her head. I don't think so. I mean it. I'm sure there's a school somewhere that would take you. Yes, Janella, Jonah interjected. Maggie hadn't noticed when he'd started listening, but as the conversation changed, they'd become a little more comfortable and less discreet. You don't know what you're saying, Jonah. Culinary school is for you, not me, Janella replied. Why not both of us? You can apply with me. We could even end up at the same school, he said brightly. It's true. Maggie nodded and turned more to her friend. If you wanted to do it, Frank would understand. We could manage while you were off studying. I'm sure it wouldn't be a problem. I could step in to help. And Olivia knows how to cook. Janella laughed. Maybe, but right now we have a hens and bucks party to cater for. Back to work. Jonah, when you're done, you can start working on your chocolate surprise tarts. Yes, the boy said, pumping his fist. Maggie and Janella laughed together. The evening was already turning out wonderfully, and the fun had only just begun. Lord, let this night be one of many to remember. May it be filled with love, joy, and peace. Father, I ask that you give inspiration to Janella and Jonah. Show them your full potential. Help them to see all that they can be and allow them to live without limits. Bless Joshua and Stella as they prepare to take these first steps into matrimony. May your hand be upon them, and may your grace surround them. In Jesus' name, Amen. Joshua stood sipping his soda and laughing with Stella's cousin, Ned. He was an insurance agent from Cootamundra who moonlighted as a stand-up comedian. He was quite good. At least Joshua found him funny. Then the rabbi says, Ned stated, but Joshua missed the punchline. He'd picked up something in his periphery, a gate he hadn't seen at Goddard Downs in a very long time. Sean, he whispered under his breath. He turned to Ned and patted him on the arm. Excuse me a moment, will you? Sure, do what you have to, I'll be here, the other man replied with a chuckle. Joshua's heart raced as he peered through the crowd. Sean hovered on the outskirts, far enough not to be a part of the festivities, but close enough to be seen. Joshua wove his way through the crowd, shortcutting through the makeshift dance floor. The real one would be installed on the morning of the wedding. Although Sean had been so against the marriage, Joshua had sent an invitation anyway, but he hadn't expected him to come. But here he was. Joshua prayed he wasn't there to cause trouble. His steps quickened. His cousin was dressed in a simple white t-shirt and jeans. His arm was in a cast. What had he done now? Sean, I didn't know you were coming. He was breathless by the time he reached him. Sean shrugged, grinning. Couldn't miss this shindig. Joshua raised a brow. I thought you were against me getting married. Sean shrugged again. Yeah, well, you're my cuz. How could I miss it? Joshua blew out a breath. What are you really saying, Sean? His cousin lifted his head slowly and met his gaze. I've been a jerk, okay? I admit it. He kicked at the grass with his boot. I didn't want you to get with Stella. I knew that if you did, everything would change, and it did. You stopped living the way we wanted to, the way I wanted to. I knew you'd change because you were never really about that life. I knew it, and I knew that having her in your life would make you see it. He was right. Stella had made him realise that he didn't want that kind of reckless life anymore. He nodded. That's why I thought it was a mistake. I knew it would change everything between us, that we'd no longer be able to do the things I wanted, to have the life I wanted to live. You'd leave me behind like everyone else did. You'd forget me. The look of despondency in Sean's eyes rendered Joshua speechless. All he could do was stand and listen as his cousin poured out his heart, as he'd never heard him do before. I'm not the smartest guy. I could never be a success at anything but riding bulls, and without you there to support me, even that seemed impossible. Everyone sees me as a waste. You were the only one who didn't. I didn't want to lose that. But that was selfish. I see that now. Sean, hear me out. I wanted to keep you and Stella apart so I could have my dreams. I never once considered what you wanted. I was happy as long as we were on the same page. I lied to myself that you'd be happy doing whatever made me happy. I didn't think of you. I'm sorry. It's okay, mate. No harm done. Joshua gave a smile he hoped conveyed his forgiveness. I know it might be too late to say this, but I had to. I couldn't let you get married hating me. Joshua stepped forward and clapped a gentle hand on Sean's shoulder. I never hated you. I love you, mate. I just wanted you to be happy for me. I wanted you to be happy. Sean's eyes glistened. Don't get all mushy on me, Josh. You know I'm not a sappy fella. Joshua laughed. Mushy? You're the one who drove 3 hours to get here to say this. Doesn't that count as some level of mushiness? At least sentimentality? Not at all. It's called owning up to your mistakes. Though his tone was serious, there was a hint of a laugh in it. A bit of the Sean that Joshua was used to seeing. So how'd you come by a broken arm? Sean glanced down at his arm and laughed. Ha! The last bull I rode was craftier than I thought. He bucked me right off in less than 5 seconds. I fell on my arm and broke it in 2 places. I've got 2 pins in there now. You had surgery? Why didn't you call? I would have come, Joshua said, shocked. Sean shrugged. I didn't think you would. Of course I would have. You're my cousin, Sean. We've always been there for each other. Not recently, but that's my fault. So what are you going to do with yourself now? How are you getting by? Sean shrugged. Not sure. I'll figure something out. Are you working? He shook his head. Joshua's mind ticked over. We've got a new hand, David, Serena's husband, but there's always room for another. The more there are, the lighter the load. The way I left before, I don't think I'd be welcome. I think that was one time too many, Sean replied. Joshua squeezed his shoulder. You might be surprised. The Bible says to forgive 70 times 7. That's right, Joshua turned. His dad had appeared out of nowhere, and at Goddard Downs we practice what we preach. Sean blinked. Uncle Frank. Sean, good to see you, he said, smiling. I'm sorry to intrude, but I couldn't help but overhear. You were listening, Dad. I was, and I'm glad. He turned to Sean. I won't pretend that I was pleased with how you left here. However, knowing you and Joshua as I do, I knew there was something more to it. Having heard your discussion just now, I understand even better. I'm very sorry, Uncle. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not going to ask for it. Frank smiled. None of us deserve forgiveness, but God gives it freely. If He can forgive, then we must too. Sean's face crumpled. You mean that? You'd forgive me? I already have, Sean. You see? Joshua said with a laugh, patting his cousin on the back. "You're welcome. Why don't you come and join the party?" Sean shook his head. "I'm not dressed for it. Besides, you and Uncle Frank might have forgiven me, but there are people over there who won't be happy to see me. I'm sure they'll have something to say about me being here." "No, they won't," his father rebutted, "and if they do, they'll have to speak to me." Sean's eyes glistened again. "Thanks, Uncle Frank." Frank patted Sean on the back and smiled. "Don't mention it. Go on, enjoy the party. You were invited, and it's a relaxed affair. We'll be right behind you." Joshua stood beside his father and smiled. "I'm surprised he came, but I'm glad." "So am I." Joshua folded his arms over his chest contentedly. "Josh?" "Yes, Dad." "Did I hear correctly that you offered Sean a job here at Goddard Downs?" He turned. "I did. I hope you don't mind. It just sort of popped out." "Not at all. Sean's a good worker. If he needs employment, I'd be happy to help. But I think you forgot something." Joshua sighed. "I know. We have to run it by the family." "Not that. I'm sure they'll be fine. No, I mean you and Indigo. Did you forget that after the wedding you and Stella won't be here anymore? Sean might not want to stay if he doesn't have you to support him." How had he forgotten? You're right, I didn't think of that." "I didn't think so, but you'd better. Sean will be expecting you to be here." His father met his gaze, gave a nod, then walked back to the party. Joshua stood silently as his father walked away. Sean was mingling with the family. Olivia and Nathan looked surprised, but they were smiling, so they seemed to be taking Sean's presence well. Joshua sought out Stella amongst the crowd. She was standing with Elizabeth, laughing. She was happy, and that was all that mattered. Whatever he said was done, and he wouldn't take it back. He breathed a sigh and headed back to the party. "There's a reason you brought him here, Lord. See it through." Chapter 27. It seemed like only yesterday they were in Darwin picking up items for the wedding. Now the big day was here. Maggie was so nervous it felt like her own wedding day instead of Joshua and Stella's. "Do you have your boutonniere?" she asked as she looked in the mirror to clip in her earrings. They were a lovely diamond starburst, a gift to herself during her trip to Darwin. She tucked her hair behind her ears, admiring the framing her new cut gave to her face. "I left it on the counter in the kitchen," Frank called from the bathroom. Maggie could just hear him over the sound of his razor. "Are you almost done?" "Just about. You?" "I'm ready," she replied, slipping her feet into her silver heels before retrieving the boutonniere from the kitchen. It was right where Frank said he'd left it. Opening the container, she admired the flower as she carefully lifted it out. How Stella found someone who sold cornflower plants she would never know. But the girl was determined. She loved cornflowers. Maggie brushed the petals lightly. Other than the colour, the flower reminded her of a large marigold. Frank walked into the room a moment later. She smelled his cologne before she heard his steps. He came up behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders and kissed her cheek. "You look gorgeous, my love." Maggie smiled and turned in his arms, adoring the scent of him. "And you look very handsome." She took the flower, which already had a safety pin attached, and pinned it to his lapel. Joshua had chosen casual wedding attire for himself and the groomsmen. Medium blue trousers, cornflower blue button-downs with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, medium grey waistcoats and matching suede shoes. Frank had chosen more formal attire, and he looked dashing in his dark suit. He grinned and stole a kiss as she adjusted the pin. "We should get going." She nodded. "Yes, I need to check on Stella and a few other things." Since there'd been several weddings in her family in recent years, including her own, and she knew the ropes, she'd taken the lead on the wedding planning. Stella's mother had been more than willing for her to take it on since she lived so far away, and now Gloria was enjoying some much-needed quiet time with her daughter before she said her I do. Frank grabbed his keys and they headed out the door. Music resounded from the main house as they parked the car. A DJ had been hired for the day and was to start testing the sound system at 12. Maggie checked her watch. "Right on time," she commented. Frank glanced at the clock on the dash.
Good man. Let's hope everything else goes to plan.
She placed a hand on his thigh and smiled. I'm sure it will. Are you okay, Frank?
Why wouldn't I be?
It's a big thing having your youngest fly the nest.
He's more than ready, and I'm so proud of him.
He's come such a long way in such a short time, she said.
Yes, I'm excited to see what lies ahead for him and Stella.
And I'm excited to see what lies ahead for you and me. She lifted her gaze and met his, grinning as he took her hand and kissed it.
I love you, Maggie.
She smiled. I never get tired of hearing that.
I hope not. I plan on telling you for the rest of my life.
She smiled as warmth trickled through her body. They were so blessed to have each other. She inhaled deeply. It was going to be an amazing day. She could feel it.
Stella, sit for a while. You're making us all anxious,
her mother said from her spot on the edge of the bed. Olivia and Nathan had given up their bedroom for her to prepare in, since it was much larger than her own.
I can't. I'm so nervous. Why am I so nervous?
She said in a voice too high to be her own.
Calm yourself.
Elizabeth stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She held Stella's hands and looked into her eyes.
Now, take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Go on, do it.
Stella mimicked the rhythmic action of her cousin's breathing.
And again,
Elizabeth said, puckering her lips as she blew out. They repeated the exercise until Stella's heart stopped racing and her mind became less frantic. She smiled at Elizabeth and then laughed. Thank you. I needed that.
Don't mention it. I don't know what you're worried about. Everything's going to be perfect. Nothing's going to go wrong, trust me.
Elizabeth and her perpetual optimism. Is this another of those things you just know? Her cousin smiled.
Yep, today will be a wonderful day. Now let's get you dressed before time runs away.
Elizabeth grabbed her hand and pulled her across the room. Her dress hung in front of the window. The pale blue curtains seemed perfectly picked to match the colours for the day. The photographer had already been in there to take preliminary shots but would return soon to take the photos of her dressing. Stella stood and admired her dress. It really is lovely, Olivia commented from behind her.
Yes,
Janella agreed. She was standing on the other side of the room with Sasha, curling her daughter's hair with an iron. Thank you, Stella smiled. Thank you all for being here. We have to welcome you into the family properly, Olivia replied. She was dressed in a calf-length, strapless dress which suited her tall, slender frame, and she looked totally glamorous. A knock on the door announced the photographer's return, and soon they were arranging themselves in their different stages of undress so the makeup artist could save time with each of their faces, and the photographer could get her shots without wasting time.
Sit here, Stella,
Lucinda the stylist called. She patted the high back of the chair that sat in front of the vanity. Stella took a deep breath and sat, but she couldn't keep her eyes off of her dress, which was still hanging in front of the window. It had a feel of whimsy to it, from the flowing material and uneven hemline that formed petal shapes around her ankles. The dress had spaghetti straps and a cornflower blue sash around the middle that hung down the back. The second she saw it in the store, she knew it was the one. Lucinda was a miracle worker, and soon Stella's hair was coiled in dozens of large curls and pinned back from her face with pearl-tipped beads. She's ready, she said when the last pin was in place.
Time for the dress,
Elizabeth announced. I have it, Maggie said, smiling. Stella hadn't even noticed Maggie arriving. Hey, Maggie. Hi, Stella. Your hair looks lovely, she replied, taking the dress down from the window and bringing it over to her. Here we go. While Olivia, Janella and Sasha continued to get their hair and makeup done, Maggie, her mother and Elizabeth helped her into her dress. She felt like a princess as they stood around her, adjusting it here and there until it was perfect. A tear stung her eyes as she thought how blessed she was to be supported by such an amazing group of women.
Don't cry or you'll smudge your mascara,
Elizabeth warned. Lucinda laughed. Waterproof, hun. Haven't you heard of it?
Fine,
her cousin replied.
Still, red and blotchy doesn't look good for photos.
I don't get red and blotchy when I cry, Stella said.
Not you, me. If you cry, you'll start me off, and I want to look good for the photos.
Everyone laughed. When they were ready, Maggie called them together. Ladies, if you would. I'd like you to circle Stella and hold hands. What are we doing? Sasha asked. We're going to pray for Stella, Maggie said quietly as she took Sasha's hand in one of hers and Gloria's in the other. Stella glanced at her mother. She appreciated being prayed for, but what would her mother think? There was no need to worry. Her mother gave a nod and then bowed her head as Maggie began to pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We rejoice in it. We praise you for bringing Stella and Joshua together. You knew before the beginning of time the wonderful plans you have for these two young people. And we know that you'll be with them through all the years that lay ahead. God, richly bless them and make today the most memorable day of their lives. Grant them understanding, patience, and never-ending love, that they can stay side by side through every tide of life. Be their rock and their refuge. In Jesus' precious name. Amen. Amen, the other women chorused. Amen, Stella whispered as she slowly opened her eyes and smiled at Maggie. Thank you, she said softly. There was not a cloud in the sky as Stella stepped out of the house on her father's arm and walked slowly across the lawn towards the wedding arch. 3 rows of white chairs lined either side, each one occupied by a familiar smiling face, though she hardly saw them. Her gaze was captured by the man standing at the end of the aisle, wearing the widest grin she'd ever seen. Joshua, her beloved. He took her breath away. She'd never seen him look so handsome, but her gaze was captivated by his dazzling blue eyes. Those eyes that pulled her in and kept her lost were misty as she peered deeply into them. You look amazing, he whispered as her father placed her hand in his. So do you, she whispered back. The anxiety disappeared. There was no doubt she was marrying the man of her dreams. A grin remained permanently plastered on her face as the ceremony proceeded. They exchanged vows and rings, and still she couldn't stop smiling. Neither could Joshua. It was the strangest, most wonderful thing. Their joy was uncontainable. When the pastor announced they were man and wife, Stella blinked several times. Already? Had they gotten to that part so soon? You may now kiss your bride, he stated. Joyful tears pricked her eyes as Stella stepped towards her husband, reaching for him as he reached for her. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, their first as husband and wife. Applause ripped through the air as the sun's weakening rays shone down on them. Their families gathered around with smiles and congratulations. It felt strange being the centre of attention, but with Joshua by her side, she didn't mind at all. They greeted everyone in turn and accepted their congratulations. It was a long line, and by the end of it, Stella was glad she opted for kitten heels instead of stilettos. Finally, Janella, the last in line, approached. Congratulations to both of you, she said, smiling. I'm very happy for you. You make a stunning couple, but you already know that. Stella's cheeks warmed in a blush. Knowing how Janella initially felt about their marriage, she was very happy to have her approval now. Thank you, Janella. It means so much to us both to hear you say that. She smiled. I have a gift for you. A gift? Joshua asked. Yes, it's inside. Would you come with me? It'll only take a moment. I'd like to give it to you personally. Joshua and Stella glanced at each other. Their guests were waiting to mingle, drink and eat. They couldn't just slip away. Could they? I know you have other obligations, but I want to give you this before things get too crazy. Plus, I don't want anyone else to see it. Now Stella was curious. We can spare a minute, she said, lacing her fingers in Joshua's. Of course, Janella, lead the way, he said. We'll be right back, Stella said in response to Elizabeth's quizzical frown. They followed Janella to the house and to her bedroom. What could she have to show them that she didn't want anyone else to see? They arrived in the simple but tastefully decorated room. Someone liked green. It was all over the place, along with dozens of photos depicting her family's lives. Stella smiled at a picture of Julian and Janella when they were young, but her attention turned to the centre of the room and a chair with a large white sheet covering it. There was something underneath, but what it could be, Stella had no idea. "Joshua," Janella began, "I love you. I've loved you since we were children, and you became my little brother because you were Julian's brother. I've watched you grow up, and I've never been prouder of you. I know Julian would be, too, if he were here." Stella faced her husband. His expression was still, but there was a slight quiver in his lips. "I love you too, Janella," he said in a thick voice. She stepped closer. "I had this done in Kununurra. I thought it would look good on some vacant wall," she said with a small laugh. Stella was baffled by the statement but continued to listen. "Your brother always wanted things to go back to the way they were, but he had a misguided plan of how it should get there. In honour of that desire, I want to present you and Stella with this gift. It's something for you to keep and remember the wonderful days of your childhood. Build on those, not on what happened in between then and now. I pray it will bring you joy." Janella took hold of the sheet and with a quick movement pulled it away. Stella gasped. Painted in meticulous perfection was a portrait of Julian, Olivia and Joshua when they were children. It was beautiful. "You look about 10, Stella commented in wonder. 11, Joshua whispered. He squeezed her hand reflexively, and she turned to look at him. His bottom lip quivered visibly as his eyes moistened. "Thank you, Janella." He stepped forward and hugged her. "You're more than welcome. Happy wedding day." When Janella presented her gift, it was the last thing Joshua expected. The painting revived memories of happy times when life was carefree and he and his siblings liked each other. There'd been so many wasted years in between that were filled with misunderstanding and anger. But this was a good memory, and he would treasure it forever. "Are you okay, Joshua?" Stella asked as they left Janella's room. She clung to him and rubbed his arm. "Yes," he replied. "I wish Julian could have been here today." "We all do." She touched his cheek lightly. "I love you, Josh." He gripped her hand and kissed the inside of her palm. "Thank you for being here for me, Stella. I love you more than you know." "We have the rest of our lives for you to show me how much," she grinned. He grinned too, as he slipped his hand around her waist and pulled her close. "Since we've started with the gifts, there's no time like the present for my gift to you." Stella's brow wrinkled. "A gift for me? I thought we decided not to exchange gifts." "I got it before we made that decision," he stated. "Don't worry, you'll like it. No need to give me anything." He kissed her softly. "Now I have you, I have everything I need. Come on, let's go back to the party. I want everyone to see what I'm giving you." "Joshua?" Stella said as he took her and led her down the hallway. "Don't talk, just walk." The grin on his face grew larger, although his heart began to pound as he anticipated her reaction. The presentation of his gift had to be delayed, however, but not by long. They had to do the customary couple's arrival and endure the pre-meal speeches. Thankfully, his father kept it brief, and so did most of the others who chose to speak. Even Sean chose to say a few words. At first, Joshua was nervous, but as his cousin spoke, all concern disappeared. "I just want to say congratulations to a great couple. Stella, you've married the best guy I know. My cousin has always been the kind of guy you want to have beside you in a pinch. I wanted him to keep living the single life with me, but I realised that he's better off in a married life with you. I might not have said this before, but I ask your forgiveness for all the trouble I caused. I wish you and Joshua every happiness." He raised his champagne flute. "Congratulations." Everyone clapped, and finally it was Joshua's turn to speak. He stood, pushing his sleeves further up his arms, though they hadn't moved. It was habit. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my wife and me, I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this momentous occasion in our lives. You have no idea how much it means to us, but be assured it's a lot." He laughed while a chuckle rose amongst the guests. He turned to Stella. "My darling wife, you've given me the greatest gift I could ask for by entrusting me with your future. I want you to know that I intend to do everything in my power to ensure you have everything you need and that the life we live will be the best life you could wish for." Stella beamed at him. Taking her hand, he pulled her gently to her feet as he continued. "Stella Goddard," he began, reaching into his breast pocket to retrieve the deed. He held the envelope in his hand and placed it in hers. "I know what you want most. Therefore, I give it to you." Her forehead creased as she peered at the envelope. "Open it," he urged, hardly able to contain his excitement. She turned the envelope over and pulled out the folded paper, looking at him quizzically before unfolding it. Joshua's grin widened as Stella began to read. Her breath hitched and tears welled in her eyes. "Joshua, it can't. You didn't. Oh my!" She turned to her parents. "Mum, Dad, it's indigo. Joshua's given me indigo." "What?" Her father jumped to his feet and peered at the deed. Gloria stepped forward to hug Stella. They both shed tears. Finally, Stella turned back to Joshua, eyes still glistening. "You crazy, wonderful man. I love you so much." She kissed him repeatedly. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." On cue, the song they'd chosen for their first dance, The 12th of Never by Johnny Mathis, began to play. He led her onto the dance floor and, taking her in his arms, deed still clutched in her hand, he slow danced her across the floor. Chapter 28. Frank sat holding Maggie's hand as everything transpired. Stella's reaction to the return of Indigo Downs was everything he imagined it would be. He was glad they were happy. He was glad that God saw it fit to not only bring Joshua and Stella together, but to return to her what had been lost. He smiled. "You are truly remarkable, Father." "Wonderful," Maggie whispered to him. "Yes," he whispered back. He turned to her. Though the meal was yet to be served, couples were already filing onto the dance floor. Joshua and Stella had turned ceremony norms upside down, but no one was complaining. It wasn't an evening to stick to strict rules. It was a time to celebrate and enjoy. Frank rose to his feet, pulling Maggie up beside him. If everyone was going to dance, why not them? He led her onto the dance floor. On the way, he spotted Elizabeth leading a very awkward-looking Sean onto the floor with her. Frank smiled at his nephew and the apprehensive look on his face. Chuckling, he said to Maggie, "Look at that." She looked in Sean's direction and smiled. "It looks like Elizabeth has him on a short leash," she mused. "Indeed. That girl is a tidal wave. I like her." "So do I," Maggie said. They reached the dance floor, choosing a spot near the periphery. Frank took Maggie in his arms and held her close. He inhaled the scent of her hair, vanilla and brown sugar. "You smell delicious. I could eat you up." "Is that so?" she cooed. Her head was on his chest, and he knew she was listening to the beat of his heart. It was something she liked doing. He liked that she did it. "Perhaps later," Frank teased, his voice low, a whisper against her ear. He kissed her earlobe. Maggie slapped him playfully on the arm. "Frank, behave." He laughed. He loved teasing her. "What? Can't I kiss my wife?" "Yes, but not like that. At least not in public. You aren't a love-struck teenager anymore," she said through a giggle. "Why shouldn't I be? Why do the young get to have all the fun? I'm not that old. Neither are you. All our days of glory over just because we have some grey hair on our heads? I say not. I say that more than anyone, we have reason to rejoice." She looked up at him adoringly. "You have some of the most charming ideas. Tell me, what might that reason be?" "Because we've made it through the battle of life and marriage, not once, but twice," Frank replied.
Because I love you more each day. Because you make me feel young. And we want to make the most of our lives together, he grinned. Do you need more? I can go on.
No need, Maggie answered, her eyes moist. He pulled her closer, pressing her against him.
God has surely blessed us, Maggie. The child I worried about is settled and more stable than I've ever seen him. Now a married man, and soon responsible for an entire station on his own.
Are you worried about that? What he'll do without you there to guide him?
No. Joshua's lived his entire life on a cattle station. He knows what's required, even if he hasn't had full responsibility yet. It's in his blood. Any big issues, I'm sure he'll come to me, but I want him to have the room to be his own man, to be his own boss.
I hoped you'd say that, Maggie smiled.
Did you doubt I would?
No. I just wanted to hear you say it. Letting go isn't easy, especially with your children. You've never had your children leave home and stay away. I have. It was difficult for me to see Serena and Jeremy go off to live their lives. It can't be easy for you. You want them to be independent. We teach them that, but watching them go is another thing. Part of you still wants to hold on.
Frank smiled. How do you know me so well?
She'd spoken directly to his heart, saying the things he felt but couldn't verbalise. He felt strange, just a little something, nothing worth considering. But the moment Maggie said it, every word rang true. He hugged her.
I'm going to miss him.
She rubbed his back soothingly. I know, but I'll help you through it.
I feel a little silly feeling this way. Indigo isn't that far.
But it's far enough. Enough to make you feel like an outsider looking in. Frank sighed.
I haven't had to let them go like this before. After Esther, I tried to keep them close. I got Olivia back. Now I've lost Julian. And Joshua's leaving.
You have me, Maggie said, lifting her gaze.
Yes, I do. And I'm the most blessed man alive.
Frank smiled, gazing into her eyes as they slow danced to the music. She rested her head against his chest. I love you, Frank. I'm so glad I married you.
And I'm glad I married you.
He kissed her forehead while they continued dancing. The sun was slowly setting. Shards of orange melted into a purplish blue, casting a soft light across the paddocks. Frank watched the sun drop below the horizon. It was like a message from God. One chapter was over, but a new one was beginning. There would be darkness, but there would be joy. Joshua and Stella were starting something new, and God would bless them. He knew it in his bones. He looked around, finding his children and grandchildren in the crowd, noting their happy, smiling faces. Everything was as it should be. The world was at peace, at least at Goddard Downs. At least for now.
I pray this lasts forever, Lord. Smile on Goddard Downs. Smile on my family. Bless them. In Jesus' name, Amen.
This is the end of Slow Dance at Dusk. Frank and Maggie's story continues in Book 5, Slow Trek to Triumph.
Click the link below to listen now.